From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast about the many paths and forms of local leadership. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Today, I'm honored to share an extended conversation with U.S. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, recorded live on May 2nd as part of the Spring 2025 Leadership Dialogues hosted by RELI, the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. You can watch the full interview on YouTube. Just click the link in the show notes.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Hines. I am one of the co-directors of the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative here at the Schar School at George Mason in Northern Virginia. This is our 8th year of programming, and our programming is designed to support elected and appointed leaders in the Northern Virginia region and across the Commonwealth as they do the very, very important work of leading our jurisdictions and our Commonwealth. We're grateful to AT&T for being RELI's lead sponsor in 2025, and we appreciate their support. And we are so excited to open our spring leadership dialogues with Senator Tim Kaine today. If you know Senator Kaine, you can't help but respect the work that he's done over decades. And as we all know, he started his elected service career as Richmond's mayor, and he served at every level of government and has personal knowledge of the work that so many of the people who are attending this webinar do every day. So we're really pleased that he managed his schedule to be with us today. I'm also pleased to introduce today's moderator. Matt Lehrman is a civic facilitator, mediator, and speaker whose firm Social Prosperity Partners specializes in helping municipalities and school boards across the country navigate complexity, resolve conflict, and strengthen civic trust. He also hosts the Community Catalyst podcast, which explore real-world lessons in local leadership. And we've been pleased this year at RELI to collaborate with Matt to identify Northern Virginia elected and appointed leaders who are focused on the challenges and opportunities facing Northern Virginia.
Mary, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to George Mason University, the Schar School of Public Policy, and of course, the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative. Senator Kaine, welcome and good morning to you. And thank you so much for joining.
Matt, great to be with you. If Mary Hines or Jay Fassett are asking, I'm likely to say yes. But if they're both asking, I'm always going to say yes. And George Mason is special to me because my wife, Ann, is also on the faculty at the Schar School. So I'm really happy to be together with you and with so many great local and regional leaders. It'll be a good opportunity to talk.
Fantastic. And can you hear me okay?
I can, absolutely.
Fantastic. So, Senator, before we get into current events, I'd love to ask you for a quick reflection about something, especially for our audience who are local civic leaders here in Northern Virginia. You began your career in public service on Richmond City Council in 1994, and then you became mayor just 4 years later. Thinking back on how those early years played out, is there a particular experience or insight that still helps you shape how you think about the role and responsibility of public leadership, especially during times of complexity or crisis?
Matt, there are many. I will say that, having been a mayor, I feel like that was the best preparation that you could have for later being governor or being senator. In city politics or local county politics, local leadership, you might be a Democrat or Republican, and we tend to know that about each other, but people really measure you based on results, and they want you to work together and solve problems. And so I think I developed some really good habits, both in terms of being a problem solver, but also being accessible. And that's what you can do in local government. When I was the city council and mayor of Richmond, there was a particular challenge that we faced. We had many challenges. Very, very proud of our city and the renaissance that it's undergoing. But the challenge we had was we were the second highest homicide rate in the United States when I got elected to city council. And the citizenry was just begging for answers. We weren't a high crime city if you looked at property crimes, auto thefts, arsons, but murders and aggravated assaults, crimes committed with weapons, we were very, very high. And I just remember going to too many crime scenes, funerals, wakes, homicide victims support meetings in church basements. I mean, it was a very, very challenging time. And I learned in that crisis that, you got to be with people right up close. Even when you don't have the answers, you got to be with people. They want connection. And then we also learned together, the city council I was on, there were 9 of us. We learned together to experiment. Try this, it didn't work. Try that, didn't work. Try another thing, it didn't work. It took us a year and a half of trying different strategies before we finally hit upon some strategies that were really successful. And violent crime is one of the most measurable things. There's other things we do that's hard to measure. Emergency preparedness, hard to measure. But violent crime, you can measure it. And we eventually cut the homicide rate by about 60%, violent crime by more than 40%. But it was only through kind of experimentation. And that's something at the local level that you can do. But you have to be willing to say, hey, I tried this and it didn't work, so we're going to try something else. So sometimes we get too wedded to our the proposal that we've made rather than the results, and are we actually fixing the problem we set out to fix? So those were some very powerful lessons that have served me well in the subsequent 30 years.
I'm so glad we're recording this conversation, because I'm going to even have to go back and just listen to, again, everything that you just said. But here's what I got so far. Being responsive, being nimble, being accountable to measurable results.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the responsive, it's a little more than that. It's really connection in the empathetic way. You want to be responsive to concerns, obviously, but I often say when I'm going into any event, it's not about perfection, it's about connection. People are not coming there so that they will agree with 100% of things that you say. They would question if they did, whether you were being honest with them. They want you to be with them in the moment, connected with them.
So let me ask you now to fast forward just a little bit. You obviously went on to serve as lieutenant governor and as Virginia's 70th governor, and you took office right before the Great Recession. So leading through a prolonged economic downturn, and I understand that you also had an agenda for, major investments in education and healthcare. There must have been a real tension between urgent needs and long-term goals. And I'm wondering if there's something that you've also come to understand about how to maintain priorities and keep momentum when a challenge is going to stretch out over many years and possibly even evolve in unexpected ways.
I think success, and I was taught this lesson by a friend of mine who was on the Richmond City Council with me, success in an organization is sort of a function of goals plus relationships. And you have to be rigorous about goal setting, and they have to be clear, they have to be measurable, and they also should not be easy. You want the goal to be somewhere between, I'm going to have to gasp to do this and come just short of fainting to do it. You want it to be a real stretch. But then it's relationships that leverage the advances on the goals. You're right. I was governor during the recession, and I'm the only governor, as far as I know, who left office with a smaller budget than when I started 4 years earlier. And that was not on my bumper sticker when I ran for governor. That was not my intent. But I had to do it. I mean, the recession was hitting us, and Jay and Mary were in local government at the time. They'll remember doing the same thing. And they'll remember that the governor had to do a lot of cuts that I didn't want to do. But I used this goal plus relationship mantra in doing all these budget cuts. And unlike what's happening at the federal level now, where it's willy-nilly across the board, non-strategic, when we had to do cuts, we basically looked at everything we did with an eye to two things: the priority of that function or program and the performance of that function or program. And we made cuts on things that either were low priority or low performing. And there were things, even as we were shrinking state government at the time, there were things that we actually increased because we realized in order to really set the stage for success going forward, we needed to do more early childhood education. We were in the middle of 2 wars. We needed to spend more on veteran services. We needed to spend more on certain environmental priorities. So, Yeah, I think that goals plus relationships is the overall mantra. But then as you're looking at budgetary decisions, whether it's adding or subtracting, you have to do it by rigorous attention of priorities and performance, rather than what we're seeing, the chaotic, cutting that's going on at the federal level right now.
This question I want to ask, usually it's the last question I ask in an interview, but I don't want to wait till the very end. I want to ask you this right up front, because across your career, from City Hall to the state capitol, and now obviously to the U.S. Senate, you've led through periods of profound change and division and crisis and uncertainty. And I wonder, is there some principle or practice that you have personally that helps you resist ever feeling defeated or falling into cynicism?
I think I'm blessed with just sort of a naturally optimistic personality. I mean, as anybody with kids knows, their personalities kind of manifest themselves so early. My mother taught me a lesson once when I was in high school that I've always tried to cling to, which was, she heard me saying something kind of snarky like a teenager does, pessimistic about something. And she says, you got to make a choice in life, whether you would want to be right or do right. And if you want to be right, be a pessimist, because sometimes events, will prove that you're right. And you can say, I told you so, if that turns you on. But if you'd rather do right, be an optimist, because optimism can often shape events in the right direction. And optimism is also, Matt, a precondition of something else that's important. Every problem that we deal with has an answer. It's just that I'm not the one that has the answer. Somebody has the answer, and it may be a very unlikely somebody that has the answer. As soon as you're pessimistic, it's like your ears close off to the answer that you might get from a random or somewhat unexpected place. And so even when the evidence would suggest, man, I don't see a lot of grounds for optimism now in dealing with whatever the problem is, to maintain the optimistic demeanor means that you're open up to the inspiration of what somebody might tell you, or the new idea from the unlikely source. And again and again and again, through my both personal life, but also my political life, I've not known the answer, but because I kept my ears open, I found that I got an answer, sometimes from my staff, sometimes from a colleague, but oftentimes from an article I read or a chance interaction with somebody. And so, be an optimist. You'll shape the events in a positive direction, but you'll also keep your ears open for the solution to the tough problems that you're trying to resolve.
So we're going to make a little transition here, because I was interested in your background. I wanted to make sure everyone understood all of that. But I want to get into the meat of what our audience here really wants to hear from you. So, Senator, at the invitation of RELI, I've spent the last year interviewing local leaders across Northern Virginia about civic leadership and community engagement and governmental collaboration for the Community Catalyst podcast. And just recently, I facilitated 2 focus groups for RELI, where they brought together a cross-section of local leaders who spoke candidly about the challenges and concerns that their communities are facing today. And we should be clear, these conversations weren't really about partisan agendas. They were about core responsibilities of local governments. The phrase, there's no Republican or Democratic way to haul away the trash.
Yeah.
So I want to share with you some of what we heard from that focus group and invite you to respond directly to those kinds of questions. So here's the first one. Local leaders spoke of a collapse in trust, not just in government, but between neighbors. And one person said, we used to believe that the rule of law existed to help us. Now it's been weaponized so badly, some people don't even feel safe going to the grocery store. So my question is, are we, both as citizens and as community leaders, are we completely powerless to stop this, at least in the short term? And if not, what has to be done at every level to begin restoring public confidence?
It's a big topic, and I can't dispute, that observation. And I hear it from people. I was traveling around Virginia last week, and I was hearing some of the same concerns in different parts of the state. Let me begin with, if you're going to restore trust in government, the best place to begin is local government. And so that's a way of telling everybody who's on this that there's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. Why do I say that? People are cynical about government. And one of the reasons they're cynical is they don't feel like they have access to it. Oh, I'm not going to have a chance to sit down and talk to my U.S. senator or my governor. I do public events all the time, but over the course of the year, do I have a personal interaction with 1% of Virginia, 80,000 or maybe 2%, 150,000? So that means, say it's 2%. That means 98% of people I don't have personal interaction with.
Right.
But at the local government level, you can still have direct interaction with folks. And I know that's a hassle. I mean, Jay, I know, and Mary know this so well. But like, you're getting lobbied at the grocery store. You're at your kid's soccer game. You're getting lobbied. I was mayor once and somebody ran into my truck and they were writing her a ticket. And the officer said, "Mr. Mayor, are you okay?" And she goes, "You're the mayor?" I said, "Yeah." "Hey, there's a zoning issue coming up before city council next week I want to talk to you about." But you can make people believers to the extent that they're cynical or doubtful that government by, of, and for the people can work in a nation of 330 million. If they can interact directly with a local elected official, they can become believers in the government by, of, and for. Even if you have a dialogue about something, and even if you don't agree, they will have had direct access to you. So I think at the local level, you're not only serving people, but you're kind of a missionary about democracy can work even in a big nation if it begins with access. So that's the first thing that I think is so important. You're not going to solve lack of trust by having a great digital ad or a great mailer. But personal presence, I'm back to, it's about connection, not perfection.
Yeah.
Personal presence starts to build that. And then your own example. Look, all of us are really scrutinized in terms of the kind of example that we set. And that can be a lot of pressure. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all say dumb things. But trying to model the right behavior, including how you deal with setbacks, how you deal with somebody who has a different opinion than you. I remember being on the city council, and I'd have a thing I was really passionate about. Somebody on the council would go the other direction, or a senator would go the other direction on a big thing I had this week. And if I let my temper get the best of me and you dressed them down for it, then what's the chance I'm going to get them to work with me on something different tomorrow? So you have to model a behavior that is principled and firm, but also respectful that others can, reach a different conclusion than you do.
It's an interesting point. So you're saying connection is important even for people with whom you disagreed.
Absolutely. Maybe even more so.
Senator, in the RELI focus groups, we heard repeated concerns that communities in Northern Virginia and across the DC suburbs are being deliberately targeted, and not merely as collateral damage from efforts to shrink the size and scope of the federal government, but because specifically of who lives there and what those communities represent. That's a concentration of federal workers and immigrant populations and progressive political values. Many fear that their communities are being singled out for punitive treatment, not just as institutions, but as communities who feel like they're under attack. And my question for you really is, do you think it matters whether the impact is incidental or intentional?
Well, I think it's not. I think it's intentional. I mean, there is an effort to go after LGBTQ folks. There's an effort to go after immigrants. And when you go after immigrants, they're not being that careful to distinguish undocumented from legal, and they're making a lot of mistakes in that space, and they seem to be indifferent to that. And there's also there is some effort to go after communities based upon their political inclination. I had a meeting with an important interest group yesterday, public broadcasting. And, last night, President Trump announced he was cutting all funds, but they've been dealing with some funding cuts already. And I asked them, are these funding cuts happening in an even-handed way to every, public TV or public radio station or not? And they said, no, it's not been even-handed. It's a little bit where they are. And so this is a concern right now. And, I'll jump to a punchline, Matt. If you asked me when I got to the Senate, what was my job description, it would be serve Virginians, 2 words, serve Virginians. now my job description is preserve democracy and serve Virginians. I wouldn't have said preserve democracy in 2013 because it would have been something I could just completely take for granted that everybody here would share. But we were taught by our founders, the four individuals who designed the Virginia State Seal and made Sic Semper Tyrannis our state motto. July 5, 1976 was the embrace of the state seal in Williamsburg. They used this phrasing, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Semper is a future tense word. It was not down with tyrants. Tyrants are bad. We got rid of tyrants. No tyrants. It was thus be it always, thus be it ever to tyrants, because they believed human nature would always elevate tyrants who needed to be checked. And I think we're in a time right now where that prediction that they made, that tyranny would be should be a perennial concern. We have to be perennially on guard against it. I think that's the test that we're facing as the nation approaches its 250th year. So the fears that people have, I think, are very legitimate, but the answer to it is the institutions that we created, the checks and balances, but especially the opportunities for people to participate. And that's one of the most important things that local leaders of all kinds can do, is to encourage, not discourage, but encourage participation.
So it's interesting to me that you say that the can I call them attacks? It's attacks on local communities are intentional. And so we should get really granular on where those impacts are, what the responsibilities are of local governments and what they can do about it. Let's start, and I should mention again for our virtual audience, if you have questions specifically that you want to ask, put them into the Q&A. Mary and Jay are going through them. They're feeding them to me, and I'm going to come and ask some of those questions of the Senator as well. But Senator, key regional systems like Metro and other shared infrastructure are facing growing threats from this shift or this withdrawal of federal priorities. What can you share is being done in the short term to ensure essential funding services, transit systems, that they aren't undermined? And I guess I should ask, and is it too soon to be asking, can we think about the long term of how do we, get the Metro system and others out of being a punching bag?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is we have been able to get these tranches of funding for kind of 10-year periods for Metro. And I really give high praise to people like Ben Cardin, who retired, Jerry Connolly's been so great on this. And we're all thinking about Jerry this week after his announcement. We've had a good hands across the Potomac arrangement. And the other thing that has really benefited us is so many Capitol Hill staffers, for House members and senators, red or blue, they rely on Metro. So every office here on Capitol Hill has Metro, advocates. Here's what's going on big picture on the budget right now that is different than Trump term one. We have a budget that was, adopted by Congress and signed by the president. And then we did a continuing resolution at the end of March, adopted by Congress. I didn't like it. I voted against it, but it was adopted and signed by the president. But the president is not following that appropriations bill. Instead, when he announces we're going to cut funds for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, wait a minute, it's in the budget that we just passed in March. Or, we're going to cut USAID. Wait a minute, that's in the budget that we all just voted for. So the president is violating something called the Anti-Impoundment Act, which forbids him, this is a Nixon era law, it forbids a president from not following a budgetary document that has been voted on by Congress and signed by the president. But what he's doing is he's trying to just wreck a lot of stuff and then daring Congress, all right, if you want to fix it, fix it. So we have to write the fiscal year 2026 budget, and we're working on that right now. And I think what the president hopes is if I just smash as much of Humpty Dumpty as I can, you'll have a hard time putting it back together. Maybe you can put it back half together or 2/3, and maybe even some of the things you want to put together by the time you do, employees will have taken other jobs and they'll have moved on. So it's a kind of a wrecking ball strategy, but we still write the budget. So on things like Metro or, Head Start funding or community health centers, we're writing a budget. And I believe on the Senate side, it's going to be a budget that is going to look very much like a normal institutional budget. The president will send us a budget next month that will look like a complete slash and burn budget. We're going to set that aside immediately, and we're going to write a budget that that I think will look to everybody on this call, Democratic or Republican. It will look like a normal institutional budget that a Republican majority Senate would do, but it'll look kind of normal. We then have to, match it up with the House budget. There's a conference. We have to work on it together. The one thing we're having to do, Matt, in this appropriations process that we've never had to do before is we have to fix all the stuff that has been broken, or as much of it as we can. But the second thing we have to do is to be mindful of, if we write this budget and pass it and the president signs it, what's to stop him in fiscal year 26 saying, yeah, oh, by the way, I signed that, but I'm still going to do these 5 things and not do these 95 things.
Right.
And so we're having to build in mechanisms within the budget, in addition to the Anti-Impoundment Act, to try to guard against the president tanking the deal that everybody has agreed to. And so, for example, if you don't spend the money that is in the budget in the way we all agreed, funding for the executive office of the White House gets cut in half, or something like that. We're having to be creative. We've never had to do that before because no president, Democratic or Republican, has willingly decided, other than President Trump, to not follow an appropriations bill that he or she has signed.
So, Senator, that's one of the questions that's already come in from someone who's watching. Says, we're seeing a lot of changes in the government in the last few months. Many of these changes are meant to be done on a legislative level. Will we see a return to that in our federal government? Right?
Well, the questioner is right. And you might ask yourself, the question is, now let's see, why would President Trump do it this way when he has 2 Republican houses? I mean, the normal budgetary process would be the president submits a budget to Congress, emphasizing the president's priorities. And then when you've got 2 Republican houses, you call the leadership down to the White House and say, look, I'm really serious about this. I need you to stick with me on this budget document that reflects our priorities. We just got elected. We got the trifecta. The public wants us to do this. Why isn't the president doing it that way? It's because the president is not confident that even the Republican leadership of the Article I branch will go along with a lot of this nutty stuff that the president is doing. So let me just smash it all and then sue me if you think I shouldn't. And then you're writing the budget. Maybe you can put it back in. I may or may not follow it. So I do think you're going to see a return to normal budgeting after the continuing resolution was a very bad way to do budgeting. But I do know this, on the Senate side, the Appropriations Committee is the power committee. You don't work your whole life to be on the Appropriations Committee, especially get to be the chair like Susan Collins or the ranking member like Patty Murray, to just say, well, we'll just let the House send us a continuing resolution, take it or leave it 2 days before a shutdown, and we just have to accept it. No, that's not what the Appropriations Committee is going to do. So I think we will return to normal budgeting for FY26, but we have to do it mindful of the high likelihood that the president who is doing this despite an appropriations bill, the president who is not following a final order of the Supreme Court in this recent deportation case, might well accept the budget, not veto it, but then just decide to implement the pieces he likes and not the pieces he doesn't. So we have to build in some protective mechanisms to impose a painful consequence on the president and his team should he ignore the deal that we all strike.
Senator, you've just given a very optimistic expectation that the legislative process is actually going to have some weight. It's going to, it's actually going to move things. I just have to ask, is that a reflection just of your natural optimism that we've already talked about? Or on a pragmatic basis, do you actually see that working in the present moment or at work at the present moment?
Matt, I see it working very much in the Senate. I'm a little less confident in the House, only because, I'm not there all the time and I can't really read the internal dynamic as much. And I think the House is probably a little more prone to going along with the president. Many in the Senate of his party will go along, but there are a number who won't. In the last month, I led opposition to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. I convinced 3 Republicans to oppose him. I've led opposition to tariffs, the Canadian tariffs and the global tariffs. I've been able to convince some Republicans to join me in opposition. Not yet enough. I'm trying to force as many votes on these items as I can because I do think the Article 1 branch being a check against an overreaching executive. It's a muscle that needs exercise. You can't allow people just to say, well, I wish the president wouldn't do that. No, let's vote on it. Do you own it or do you disown it? So I'm trying to force as many votes as I can. And slowly, I think I'm gaining more Republicans willing to join me and stand up. So I do feel pretty confident that this budget process, in the way I described it, is going to manifest on the Senate side. But we do have to go into a conference with the House and find some midpoint between a House and Senate budget, which has proven to be hard, even just among the Republican leadership in both bodies, much less Democrats. So it's not going to be easy, but I have confidence on the Senate side that we will do something that will look to all on this call as kind of a normal institutional budget, albeit one done by a Republican majority.
Let me move to another question that came up in the focus groups. Many leaders warned of broader economic consequences, not just job losses, but in Northern Virginia, the weakening of real estate markets and tax bases and infrastructure investments that local government depends on. One person said, this isn't just one thing, it's a web of interconnected threats. So what can we be doing now? You're speaking to local leaders in Northern Virginia. What can they be doing now to protect those foundational economic pillars and prevent long-term harm?
Well, you're very right, Matt. I mean, it's not just the DOGE cuts to programs and the indiscriminate layoffs. It's other trends. During COVID, we learned we could work remotely, and a whole lot of people are now working in a hybrid way, and they weren't before. Then that affects significantly the commercial real estate market, which is an important revenue generator for local government. So there's both some current kind of trends of this administration, but then also some longer term trends that could cause concern. If I was in local government, I would be having these concerns. I tend to think, though, that the benefit of Northern Virginia and Virginia generally is our talent pool. And as long as we maintain the focus on the talent pool, education from pre-K to post-grad, accessibility to community college and college, and we make Virginia the talent state. And I think many of the Northern Virginia communities have really done this very well. Talent broadly defined. It's not just college degrees. It's high quality career and technical programs. Loudoun's, career and tech center that I have visited not long ago is just like such a model. And other communities in Northern Virginia are doing that too. So I would say, it's going to be a knowledge economy from here on out. And so maintain the focus on we're the talent state, we're the talent county, we're the talent city. And if we do, that's going to, whatever the changes in our, economies or lives or culture, or consumer preferences, the more we really are smart about educational investments, the more we'll be equipped to deal with those changes. And Northern Virginia starts on a very strong position there. When I talk to companies that are locating to Virginia, it's not the tax code and it's not the incentive package, it's the talent pool that brings people here.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to listen and process at the same time. Tell me if I got this. What I think I just heard you say was, it's not just about trying to protect those things that we already have. It's about investing in the education of the populace that we have so that they're more agile, they're better able to adapt on their own. Am I overstating that, or did I get that?
You're absolutely right. And, the more you invest, the more you invest in talent, the more that institutions that want to be around talent will say, that's where I want to go. And so it's about individual skills, but it's also about creating a pro-innovation kind of ethos that becomes super attractive to companies, to think tanks, to universities. And a lot of that also, Matt, depends upon, we've got to do something about the immigration. So we have to. Immigration has always been the transfusion into the bloodstream that's kept our nation, young at 248. We can't shut it off in this anti-immigrant hysteria without doing deep damage to the DNA of this country and the economic future of the country. So my hope is that the low unemployment rate, with many employers kind of singing the blues about that, will open up the door, even in a contentious time when immigration is one of the, third rail issues, at least on the Republican side. It will open up the opportunity for a meaningful workforce-based immigration reform. And that's a critical element. It's been critical to Northern Virginia and all of Virginia. When I was born in 1958, 1 out of 100 Virginians had been born in another country, and we were bottom quarter per capita income. Today, 1 out of 9 Virginians was born in another country, and we're top quarter per capita income. You tell me that immigration is a problem for Virginia. It's not a problem. It's been a huge part of our success over the last, decades.
Senator, I have in front of me kind of a laundry list of programs, initiatives, efforts that a lot of people have asked, what can we do to protect that? Let me just give you the kind of the quick version of this. It's not going to be exhaustive for everyone, but we've heard about mental health care, school nutrition, housing support, funding for AmeriCorps, sustaining Medicaid's role in addressing the fentanyl and opioid crisis. There's going to be even more than that.
Yeah.
What should be I guess 2 questions.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you're working on right now at the federal level that you can say there is help coming, there is protection coming, there's something that local leaders can take confidence in, or flip it around? Are there things that you would suggest that local city and county and school board leaders should be doing to protect the things or advance the things that they care about in this moment?
Yeah, I think first let's have a realistic expectation. In the Trump administration, we're not likely to make funding advances in some of those areas. We will be doing a really good job if we maintain where we are. And if we get slight advances, that will be a fantastic job. President Trump is against many of these programs, AmeriCorps, public broadcasting. I mean, one thing I'm nervous about is the Trump administration counter to my entreaty that we should focus on educational investments. I think the administration is almost pursuing kind of a privatization of knowledge agenda. When you destroy the Department of Education and you cut funding to all libraries and cultural institutions and public broadcasting, it's sort of like knowledge is out there if you can buy it yourself, but we're not going to diffuse knowledge publicly as a public good. We're going to return it as kind of a private good that you can access if you have the means to do so. I'm very, very troubled about that. The right way on the items that you mentioned, they're all items that are in the federal budget that has been embraced by both Democrats and Republicans. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, just using USAID as an example. We've had strong support from Republicans, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, bunch of them on USAID programs. And all of a sudden, they're being cut and some of those same people aren't speaking up. What we need, and what I'm advising people who come in, is you don't need to worry much about Democrats' support for some of those things that you mentioned. You got to find some Republican champions. And it's usually in the Senate, just find 3 or 4. If you can find 3 or 4 Republican champions for public radio, public TV, which in rural America is often so important in terms of educational content, emergency alerts during hurricanes and things. If you can just find 3 or 4 champions, that can really help swing it as we're writing the budget. I do think Medicaid, which was one of the ones you mentioned, is a really, really important one. Remember, President Trump tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and they actually had the votes to do that, but they took one additional step, which was to make dramatic cuts to the core Medicaid program and not just the pieces connected to the ACA. And when they went that additional step, the popular outrage was so significant that Republicans joined Democrats in voting down the ACA repeal. The Republicans are faced with a similar dilemma right now. They want to do a big tax cut bill. Unlike 2017, they're not willing to do it by jacking up the deficit. So they have to pay for the tax cuts. They want to pay for it by tariff revenue. The tariffs are absolutely screwing up the world's strongest economy 4 months ago. Now has red lights and question marks all over it because of this tariff idiocy. But the tariff revenue is to pay for the tax cut. And the other way you pay for it is with all these spending cuts. And they're fighting right now about whether they should cut Medicaid, because politically they know that would be tough. But others are saying, yeah, but we can't get to the number we want to get on the tax cut if we don't cut Medicaid. So we'll see that emerge in the next few months. But there are some cuts where if they make them to any significant degree, it really generates popular opposition. And then it's interesting, when the popular opposition surges against Medicaid cuts, it almost surges against all kinds of cuts. Medicaid is the thing that really gets people, active. But then once they're active, they're also generally active to try to protect more programs. So we're going to see what they do with this reconciliation bill that they're working on now and how much they go after Medicaid. I have a feeling they're not going to be able to avoid it. They're going to do it, and they're going to face the same kind of backlash from the public they faced in 2017.
There are a flurry of questions that came in while we were discussing this, so I want to see if I can cover a few of them all at the same time. Local governments are raising taxes and home valuations are also going up. What should local leaders do to assist residents? Then, should federal and state government raise minimum wages so young people can afford to live, for example, in Fairfax County? Young professional salaries are not enough to afford rent and home buying to stay in the area where they grew up. How can Congress help our local leaders? I think what this is all playing on is you're saying we have to invest in our population.
Yeah.
And there's a call out here that says we have to especially invest in younger adults in our community because they are the future of our communities. Is there something specific that should be focused on there?
Well, I think the on the minimum wage question, the minimum wage hadn't changed forever. And we need a minimum wage that is based on a theory, not a number, right? So, okay, it's $7.25 and we haven't changed it forever. Or at the state level, it's been changed. But what should the minimum wage do? I think we should have a minimum wage that if you work at it full time, we are above the poverty level. So I would set the minimum wage where if a full-time worker makes that wage, and I would say a worker with 2 dependents, full-time worker makes that wage, you should be above the poverty level. And that we should continue to adjust the minimum wage to accomplish that goal. We tell people work is important. We want you to work. We want you to work hard. That a full-time worker would be below the poverty level is counter to the message that we're trying to deliver about the importance of work. And about 2/3 of the people who do work full-time at minimum wage jobs are women. So there's a gender inequality component to this. So I do think we need to do it. But with respect to young people, I do think the housing issue is really a challenging one. I just got off a statewide campaign in 2024. So I was everywhere talking to everybody all the time. And one of the things I noticed during the 23-24 campaign cycle was as a statewide official, housing is always a top 3 issue in Northern Virginia, but it was a top 10 issue everywhere else. But in the 23-24 cycle, it was a top 3 issue everywhere. Floyd, Bristol, Hampton Roads, Richmond, Harrisonburg. It's a top 3 issue everywhere because of supply issues. We had not kept up a supply. And then the other issue is with mortgage rates going up, a whole lot of first-time home buyers are in homes and they're ready to buy their second home, thus opening up the first-time homes for the next generation of first-time home buyers. But they're not moving to the second home because they can't get a mortgage as good as the first one that they have. And so there's been kind of a constriction of the entry-level opportunities for home buyers. So I think tools that we have at the federal level, like the low-income housing tax credit, which is a good, solid tool that helps produce affordable, low and moderate income rental housing, we should just do more of it. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill to expand it. And that actually has some sizable bipartisan support. We can also do some things. Senator Warner has a bill that I've co-sponsored to focus on assistance for essentially first-time home buyers or first-generation home buyers that we think can also really focus on young people.
Senator, I just got a text from both Mary and from Jay, so they have a question to ask us here as well, which is, Mary says, dollars are so tight at the local level right now. Unemployment's rising with layoffs. It's hard for local leaders to find money to invest in anything. And Jay writes, federal cuts push the arguments to the local levels.
No
This
kidding.
this kind of sounds like, your experience during the Great Recession. How do you have a long-term objective and still deal with these immediate priorities that there's no escaping?
Well, and Mary and Jay do kind of highlight something that is a hypocrisy at the federal level. You can say, see, we're slashing spending and we're going to do a big tax cut. If all that means is states and localities have to increase taxes, can we really pat ourselves on the back for reducing spending and doing a tax cut? No, we're just pushing the problem onto some other level of government, which is irresponsible and even hypocritical in my view. It is hard right now to find, revenue with layoffs, with economic doldrums. I mean, look, the economy, the United States economy was the strongest economy in the world at the end of 2024. Not a perfect economy, but the strongest economy in the world. And we're a shrinking economy just 100 days later. I mean, it's disastrous. And our own doldrums are definitely affecting other nations as well. The tariff policies are hurting our allies, whom we should be working together to advance rather than fighting with them. So yeah, how do you do it? I mean, there are some interesting things going on in housing, some of which aren't super easy at the local level, but are important. I'll give you an example. My parish in Richmond, it was a classic parish on a lot that had a parish and a parish school and a convent. The school closed down 20 years ago. The convent closed down 30 years ago. We've destroyed both of the buildings, and we're turning 2/3 of the church property to affordable housing. And, the land cost is de minimis. We would rather have that used than sit vacant. And so we're going to create units of affordable housing that are affordable because the land cost is essentially nothing. And we tried it two different ways that the neighborhood didn't exactly like. But then the third plan the neighborhood did like. And so we're doing it, and the city has made some adjustments to allow it. The number of churches around this Commonwealth that have land that they would like to use for low and moderate income housing, very significant. And I would encourage localities to tackle it. And here's one that I'm going to raise with the Trump administration. The Trump administration sent the DOJ guys into the General Services Administration to look for surplus federal properties. And there are a lot of surplus federal properties. And if there's surplus, I get it. You want to hold on because you may want to use it for something. But what about devoting surplus federal properties toward housing, where the land cost could be de minimis, and thus you could do housing in a way that would be affordable? And that's the kind of thing that I think the Trump administration leadership could say, yeah, that's a good idea. So I am trying to look at some strategies on the housing side that can bring down prices and produce more supply for the low and moderate income, the workforce person, the young person just out of college. And there's some things I think the Trump administration might be willing to embrace with us.
Something that you will have particular insight about, given your experience as a mayor. Much of the federal funding that supports local communities, transportation, education, healthcare, housing, it flows through invisible channels. And when we did the focus group with local leaders, they pointed that out and they said it makes it especially that their communities are especially vulnerable to what they called silent cuts.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you have some insight in terms of, in fact, one person even said, we may not even see it until it's too late.
Right.
So what role would you have local leaders play in this moment to, raise awareness, defend, or better yet, be proactive to address those kinds of silent cuts?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm actually going to give you guys a challenge rather than an answer. Here is a concern in Trump term 2. In Trump term 1, they would take action and communicate it to Congress. And I might not like it. I wish they hadn't done it, but at least they were telling me what they're going to do. They're not doing that now. They're not telling Congress, we're going to cut CPB funding. We're going to cut USAID contracts. We hear about it the day the press release goes out, or we hear about it because a constituent like the Virginia Library of Virginia calls it. We just got told that all the library monies are being cut. So everyone on this call, do not assume that we know what you're experiencing. My state director, Corinne Charles Dungo, who's kind of like my deputy chief of staff, but she oversees my Virginia operations, 6 offices around Virginia, services to constituents, interaction with local government, interaction with state government. She is very much kind of like, with her hands on the spider web, trying to feel what's moving. But we don't get advance notice from the administration if they're going to do cuts. So anything that you're experiencing, like, is this a cut? Is this a change in policy? If you're concerned about it, confused about it, reach out to Corinne in my office or Mike Henry, my chief of staff, and say, hey, can you track this down for us? We do have good places to go to get information. Often we can't go to the agency head because they're told not even to answer questions from members of Congress. But we know enough employees at all the agencies that we can usually go right to somebody and actually get facts. So don't assume we know what you're experiencing. Share with us what you're experiencing, and we'll get you the answers the best we can.
Senator, we have less than 10 minutes to go, and a few more questions that have come in that are really interesting. Someone writes, in the community work that I do, there are organizations and community leaders who are fearful of speaking up or standing up for immigrant communities or DOJ cuts through lawsuits or public comment due to ending up as a target of the administration. What are your thoughts on how we as community leaders and local policymakers defend our communities despite fears of being targeted for funding cuts or illegal, misinformed arrests?
Yeah, no, fantastic question. And I'll tell you, some of the biggest companies in the United States are as fearful as tiny nonprofits protecting immigrants. They want to speak up against tariffs. But Trump has set up this tariff regime as, well, maybe I'll give you an exception. Okay, you're going to apply for an exception. So I'm going to be out in the press saying tariffs are a horrible idea. Then I'm going to apply for an exception. No, the president will retaliate against me. But what the companies are doing, and what I think the NGO community can do, is they're often having their industry association speak up. So if the manufacturer don't want to speak up, the National Association of Manufacturing can speak up. Similarly, if the nonprofit that's doing really important work on refugee resettlement or advising people of their rights as immigrants, if that nonprofit doesn't want to speak up, there are national organizations that can, or you can just reach out directly to us. I have conversations virtually every day with somebody who says, I'm telling you this story. Please don't mention our name, but you need to know this story. And then I can speak about it in general. Like, I'm hearing from Virginia businesses that, I'm hearing from Virginia educators that. So share those stories with us, and we'll protect your identity if you're concerned about being publicly identified as criticizing the administration.
Senator, there's a really blunt question here. It says, you stated that your job description now includes preserve democracy.
Yep.
Do you think that Americans define democracy the same way? To some, democracy would allow someone to run for president for a third term.
Yeah, I don't think all define it the same way, but I think there is still a basic American consensus against kings, against tyrants. This Virginia, sic semper tyrannis. They warned us in 1776, tyranny was a fact of human nature, not a stage in historical development that's in the rear view. It's a fact of human nature that every human being would kind of like to have it our way, but tyrants, aggrandize their power and they try to seize power. And that's what we're in right now. Donald Trump is a tyrant, except to the extent that the American public and the American institutions check the urge toward tyranny that he has. I am of the belief that enough Americans also believe that. I mean, to give you an example, the Abrigo Garcia case, without necessarily being like super supportive of people who are here undocumented, most Americans overwhelmingly are supportive of the notion, yeah, but you can't throw somebody out of the country without due process. The 14th Amendment says you can't deprive a person of property or liberty without due process of law. The 14th Amendment has some other provisions that are reserved for citizens, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But due process and equal protection guarantees are to persons, not just citizens. And I've been really heartened to see in the reaction to the Supreme Court decision saying, hey, President Trump, you said you deported this guy by mistake. You got to facilitate his return. Overwhelmingly, whatever Americans think about immigration policy, they do believe in due process. You shouldn't be deprived of liberty or property without due process. That is a bedrock principle that Americans believe in. So you're right. People might have different views of democracy. And let's be clear, what we're talking about here is liberal democracy. And I don't mean liberal like left, because you have to have a democracy that protects the liberties of minority groups. A pure democracy can be pretty frightening if you're part of an oppressed minority group, a racial minority or LGBTQ or a religious minority. You could say, well, hey, we're a pure democracy, but majorities can do bad things to minorities. And so it has to be a democracy that protects the rights of even small groups. And that's what a liberal democracy is. It's a democracy that protects the liberty, even of one person, regardless of what the majority might think. You're going to protect the liberty of one person. And if you start saying, now we're not protecting your liberty because, we don't like your tattoos or we don't like that you're from El Salvador, then the whole thing starts to unravel.
I have one last question for you, but before I do it, just two quick comments. There is a comment that came in that just wanted to make sure that we elevate the conversation. We've been talking about, the collaboration of leaders in Northern Virginia, but they wanted to make sure we're talking about all the suburbs of the DMV. We're not just isolated in Northern Virginia. And that's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Before I ask you my final question, I'm wondering, is there any other message that you want to share? Anything else that you're working on or anything else that I haven't asked you about that you want to make sure that leaders in Northern Virginia understand is essential to know in this moment?
Well, it's not every generation of Americans that is in leadership positions at a time of dramatic national self-definition. In the 1850s and 60s were at that time. You could argue the 1950s and 60s were that time. Many generations of leaders are leading not at a time of intense national self-definition. We are in such a moment, not just because of, this president, but look, we're going to celebrate 250 years of being a democracy in 2026. And so the burden is on our shoulders. We got to make that a celebration, not a coronation, not a requiem or a wake. We got to make it a celebration. We also have to acknowledge that a functioning democracy isn't measured by, can we do it the same way we used to? If we're not updating, innovating, revising, thinking differently about what democracy, liberal democracy means, we're not really doing our job. And that's another reason why we want young people involved, because they're going to have their own conceptions. And, we're putting the batons in their hand and they're going to take it forward. But I would say the last message I would give to everybody on this call is you're in leadership at a crossroads moment. Whether we wish that were true or not, it is true. It's absolutely true. And we're going to be having a lot of opportunities. And Virginians, we like history, and we're going to have a lot of opportunities in the next year or two to think about our place in history, what 250 years means. Can we safely predict its passage into the future? So the job's on our shoulders to make 2026 a celebration, not a coronation or a wake.
Senator, you may have actually answered my last question, but I'm going to tell you what the question was anyway, in case I missed anything. We asked local leaders to describe their mood right now, and we got a raw mix of emotions. We heard shaky, cranky, worried, mad and scared, but we also heard steadfast, ready to lead, and determined to fight. And a number of people said we need a strategy and we need leaders who are willing to stand up and stand out. And so is there anything that you would advise else in this moment that local leaders should be doing right now? That's the last question for 60 seconds and then we'll end.
I think the battle today is between destroyers and builders. And so be a builder. Be a builder. it is really between destroyers and builders. And I've been, in politics, we oversimplify stuff. And so that's kind of oversimplifying, but I really believe that there is a destructive element that can be attractive in the short term, kind of a sugar high or sugar low, for people who are mad about this or that. But I don't think fundamentally Virginians or Americans are people who want to just wallow in the negative emotion. They want to see progress. They want to see building. They want to see improvement. And so just, in your own work and your own job, think about, okay, I'm going to be a builder to counter the destroyers. And there's just so much good we can do. But I mean what I said earlier. You might have more of an ability to create believers in democracy at the local level because people feel distant from the state level or distant from the federal level. You have an important role to create believers in this 250-year, journey, and give people hope and confidence that it can continue. So thank you for shouldering that responsibility at a really important moment in time.
Senator Tim Kaine, thank you for your candor, your insight, your optimism, your commitment, your continued commitment to public service. These are obviously challenging times, but this conversation reminds us that leadership isn't defined by certainty. It's defined by clarity and courage, connection, and the willingness to keep showing up. And let me also, in conclusion, say thank you to everyone who joined us live. The pressures facing your communities are real, but so is your responsibility and your opportunity to lead. Whether you're on a school board, city council, county board, or regional authority, the work of strengthening your community doesn't begin in Washington. It begins with you and with how you join together with other regional leaders. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. Thank you all for being part of this important conversation and for all that you do to lead in your community. My heartfelt thanks to RELI, the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, for inviting me to conduct this conversation and for their continued sponsorship of the Community Catalysts podcast. It is a privilege to help share the voices and experiences of local leaders throughout Northern Virginia. And a sincere thank you to U.S. Senator Tim Kaine for being so generous with his time and so open in his reflections. He offers a powerful demonstration about what it means to lead with humility and integrity and purpose, especially in times of uncertainty. I am very grateful. If you found this episode meaningful, please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Your feedback helps others discover the show. And don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. If you have a question or a comment about today's conversation, I'd love to hear from you. Reach me at 602-688-2724 or Matt, M-A-T-T, at socialprosperity.us. Do you have a story of local leadership that's worth sharing? Click the podcast guest links in the show notes. I'm always looking for thoughtful and inspiring voices to feature. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.